sure thing. What say we touch each other? Mess around and get a thing going on.
So some bands, they're kind of like, here's four people, they're a band. And with Funkadelic, we're kind of at the other end of the spectrum from that. So the name that's really important here is George Clinton, and he was effectively the band leader for uh, Funkadelic and also for a band called Parliament. Um, but the separate existence of these two was never very clear. Um, and they operated often the same musicians in both bands. Um, they they were kind of born out of some vocal stuff that he was doing in the 60s, and the band that were a backing band. He was part of this vocal group called the Parliaments, and there was contractual reasons for them starting to perform under a different name uh, with the musicians, so the instrumentalists, because singers are musicians as well. And the name Funkadelic was born, and then later, not a lot later, Parliament was also born. Um, Funkadelic kind of existed from about 1969 to 1982. The edges of this are never very clear. They've had lots of members over that time and a few kind of reunions and stints since. During that kind of core period, they had 13 albums. And the, you might just think it's two names, but actually there was a stylistic difference between these two bands, despite having most of the same people at times. So Parliament was the more radio friendly, more dancey funk kind of end, and Funkadelic was the more psychedelic end of the spectrum. And I would say that in some ways to think of it as funk is maybe a bit misleading because it tends to be more kind of acid rock. And I think the key here is to think of them as being similar to Jimi Hendrix. So this was the first album that was released under the Funkadelic name. It's possibly not what you might imagine. You hear the name Funkadelic, you think it's probably going to be funk, and in some ways it is, but it's more acid rock, I would say, with a bit of a funk leaning. So some of the sounds in here, the rhythms, particularly the guitar sound, is quite funky. But it's you shouldn't be thinking James Brown. You should be thinking more like Jimi Hendrix. So it's definitely rock. It's odd. It's very spacey and open, and uh, it's kind of the opposite of tight in that sense. It's not kind of bam, we're starting, then bam, we're finished. It's kind of everything flows into everything else. The track structures are not conventional. Um, and so if I was going to get poetic, which I will, I'd say it's loose and warm and kind of like a steaming gumbo. It's fluid, it's mellow, and somehow also quite dark. Apparently, some people felt quite threatened by it when it was first released. Um, and but somehow it's kind of content as well. It's not angry. Um, it's very psychedelic in its production. There's a lot of echoes and reverb and phasing stuff going on, and the content is definitely at times not safe for work. The whole thing's a bit like a trip in some ways. Not that I know what a trip feels like. Um, and there's some vague ramblings. There's some stories told. It's kind of pro drugs. There's some ripe language going on at points. And it's definitely an experience. The first track reminds me a lot of "Whole Lot of Love" by Led Zepp. That's the kind of area that we're in. But generally, it's maybe a bit more mellow than rocky than that. But Yeah. So I found it interesting. I didn't find it as engaging as some of the later stuff from the Parliaments and Funkadelic stable, but not bad.
So I reached in my inside pocket and got my harp out. Sit down by old beat up railroad train. To get myself a little bit of that old funky thing.